For more than a decade, millions of people believed they were viewing something unbreakable. A man who never slowed down. A veterinarian who seemed resistant to tiredness, danger, and even time itself. Dr. Jan Paul was more than just a celebrity on television. He was a symbol of endurance. However, something was subtly growing toward an unanticipated moment beneath the steady hands and well-known smile. And when that moment eventually arrived, it didn't just transform a show, it changed everything. The guy before the myth. Long before television cameras followed him through muddy barns and emergency calls in the dead of night, Jan Harpole was simply a farm child formed by scarcity, responsibility, and animals that depended on human care to exist. He was born on September 4, 1942, in the small village of Wateren in Drenthe, in the Netherlands, a country still recuperating from the destruction of World War II. Food was scant, resources were scarce, and survival demanded discipline. Jan was the youngest of 6 children, growing up on a dairy farm where labor was not choice and childhood ended early. On the farm, life was unrelenting. Cows needed milking every morning and evening. Animals suddenly became sick. Deaths and births were commonplace occurrences. While some children might have recoiled from the dirt and physical demands, Jan leaned into it. He watched intently. He learnt via observation, and he developed a quiet comprehension of animal behavior that no textbook could teach. It was more than just his house on the property. It was his classroom. At the age of 12, a decisive occasion arrived. The local veterinarian permitted Jan to help birth the piglets when a mama went into labor. It wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was actual physical work, blood, urgency, responsibility. For the first time, Jan saw what it meant to intervene at the edge between life and death. That moment didn't worry him. It focused him. From that day forward, becoming a veterinarian was no longer a dream. It was a decision. His route forward was not easy. Post-war Netherlands did not grant privilege or shortcuts. Jan studied relentlessly, winning his way into Utrecht University, one of Europe's most challenging veterinary programs. Veterinary medicine at Utrecht was unforgiving, focused on surgery, pathology, anatomy, and extensive hours spent at teaching hospitals. Students were taught to think practically, to make decisions with limited resources, and to understand that perfection was rarely feasible. Jan thrived in that environment. He didn't chase prestige or metropolitan careers. His attitude remained ingrained in rural life, where animals were livelihoods, not luxury. In 1961, during a high school exchange program, Jan spent a year in Michigan. That year would subtly change his life's trajectory. It was then he met Diane Dalrymple, an American student whose calm strength and practicality complemented his own. When Jan returned to the Netherlands to continue his studies, the link endured. After receiving his veterinary degree in 1970, Jan made an unexpected decision. He would leave his homeland and move to the United States. By 1971, Jan and Diane landed in Michigan, far from comfort or certainty. Jan started a rural veterinarian practice, working long hours across great distances while tending to enormous farm animals. The work was physically punishing. Emergency calls arrived at all hours. Winters were terrible, but everything was familiar. It felt honest, and throughout the course of the following 10 years, Jan established a reputation for dependability rather than promotion or recognition. If he was summoned, he came. If an animal needed help, he didn't hesitate. Jan and Diane took another chance in 1981. They moved to Weidman, Michigan, and formed Pole Veterinary Services, starting with a single room built into their garage. Interest rates hovered above 20%. Failure was a genuine possibility. But the clinic grew because trust rose. This veterinarian didn't overpromise. Farmers informed each other. He didn't overcharge. He labored till the task was completed. When the real world and the camera met. By the time television entered Dr. John Paul's world, he had already been practicing veterinary medicine for nearly 4 decades. He wasn't aiming for stardom, and he wasn't interested in changing how he worked. That was precisely why the notion appealed to television producers. What they saw wasn't polish or spectacle. It was authenticity. And genuineness was uncommon in a time when manufactured reality predominated. Jan's son, Charles Pole, who decided to pursue a career in entertainment instead of veterinary medicine, was the catalyst for the change. Charles discovered something that most outsiders had missed while working in television. His father already had a dramatic, erratic, and emotionally packed daily schedule. There was no need to fabricate conflict. Life on a rural veterinarian circuit offered it naturally. In 2010, Charles returned to Michigan with a tiny team and documented a single week of his father's job. They recorded the unvarnished realities of a country veterinarian's life, including births, emergencies, tiredness, laughter, and aggravation. From around 27 hours of footage, they prepared a brief proposal. National Geographic Wild realized immediately what made it interesting. This wasn't a performance. Jan Paul didn't wait for cameras. He didn't repeat himself. He didn't pause to give an explanation. In order to keep up, the crew had to pursue him and frequently used GPS to trace his movements. Audiences reacted to The Incredible Dr. Paul's premiere because the guy at the center seemed real, not because the situations were surprising. The program soon rose to the top of the network's performance rankings. Viewers related with Jan's frank honesty, his refusal to dramatize outcomes, and his notion that veterinary practice was about service, not perfection. He didn't guarantee miracles. He vowed effort. That approach connected powerfully, especially with rural families who saw their own experiences reflected in his work. But the cameras changed more than visibility. They altered scale. Approximately 100 hours of footage were needed for each episode cycle, which took place over the course of 8 months every year. That meant Jan Paul was no longer merely responding to emergencies. He was being watched all the time. The clinic continued to move quickly. Farm calls didn't pause. Rather, an already taxing burden was silently compounded by pressure. Behind the scenes, production staff confronted challenges they weren't trained for. Big animals don't act appropriately for cameras. They panic, they kick, they break free, and while spectators witnessed controlled outcomes, crew members lived with daily near misses Calves slipping shackles, cattle rushing suddenly, animals responding violently under stress. Jan P. handled these risks as usual. He had always done so, but for the people around him, normal didn't imply safe. The day everything transformed. By the time the great Dr. Paul reached its apex, the routine of Dr. Jan Paul's existence had become punishingly unsustainable. Filming dates overlapped with genuine emergencies. Long farm calls spilled into production days, and the guy at the center of it all was no longer in his prime. He was in his late 70s, still working the way he had in his 40s, carrying large animals, stooping in freezing barns, reacting swiftly to unanticipated situations. Danger had become the norm behind the scenes. Later on, crew members acknowledged that almost every shoot was dangerous. Cattle were rarely entirely confined. Calves broke free and ran away. Bulls slammed into the posts. Alpacas suddenly kicked. One crew member was flipped onto their back after a 300-pound calf broke free and ran right under them. In another instance, while being castrated, a huge bull broke a barn post in two. These incidents were never broadcast. They were seen as an integral aspect of the work. The most serious event occurred during what was supposed to be a regular shot involving beef animals. The environment was tight, animals upset, space restricted, cameras rolling. A cow that was not entirely secured suddenly broke loose and charged. One of the crew members was knocked down hard, smacked with full force. The collision was significant enough to scare everyone present. What made the matter worse was that the footage was lost. There was no dramatic replay, no warning to viewers. Only people on site realized how close it had come to catastrophe. That moment transformed the atmosphere permanently. For the first time, living in a rural area made it impossible to reduce the hazards. Network executives began asking questions they had ignored for years. How many close calls had there been? How many injuries hadn't been documented? What would happen if the next impact was worse? If it involves the veterinarian himself, Dr. Paul, true to form, didn't see the episode as a turning moment. He continued working. When he could, he upheld safety regulations. Age, however, was no longer on his side. Reaction times slowed. Balance wasn't what it used to be. It was no longer possible to ignore the repercussions of the job that had previously been instinctive. Loss, pressure, and an incapable body. As the safety worries mounted, another weight was pushing down on Dr. Jan Paul. One far heavier than cameras or insurance reviews. His personal life was disintegrating in ways no professional training could prepare him for. In February 2016, his family was rocked by the loss of his son-in-law, Gregory Scott Butch, following a long fight with cancer. Gregory was more than just a married family member. He was an integral part of the Paul family. There was a void left by his passing that could not be filled by labor. Then tragedy struck once more in September 2019, this time with awful finality. Dr. Paul's grandson, Adam James Butch, died abruptly at just 23 years old. The loss was abrupt, unexpected, and impossible to rationalize. For a man who had spent a lifetime rescuing lives, the powerlessness of that moment wounded worse than anything he had known. Those close to him sensed a difference. He was still present. He continued to work. But the comfort, the lightness viewers once recognized, was gone. His body was failing him at the same time. Chronic discomfort persisted all the time. His gaits halted. Things he used to do on his own now needed help. Staff members increasingly stepped in, not out of procedure, but necessity. Yet, Dr. Paul resisted stepping back. Veterinary medicine was not merely his career, it was his identity. Slowing down felt like surrender. Even as filming grew more rigorous and recovery from physical strain took longer, he insisted on being present. However, there was no denying the boundaries. Production plans had to adapt around his pace. The clinic redistributed duties. The indomitable figure audiences had known was now obviously human. Criticism from within the veterinary profession added another layer of tension. Lawsuits, probationary rulings, and appeals played out publicly, questioning procedures he had depended on for decades. Some rulings were overturned, some upheld, but the emotional trauma lingered. Every challenge appeared to converge at once: grief, age, scrutiny, and tiredness. By the early 2020s, it was evident that something fundamental had shifted. The program was still in progress. The clinic was still working. But the man holding everything together was carrying more than he ever had before. And for the first time, it was more than he could outrun. The decision no one wanted to make. By the early 2020s, the debate surrounding the extraordinary Dr. Paul was no longer about ratings or popularity. The show was still one of National Geographic Wild's most recognizable programs. It had achieved significant milestones, developed a devoted following, and become ingrained in the network's character. The question was easier and significantly more painful. Could it safely continue? Internally, the answer was becoming harder to avoid. Reviews of safety had accumulated. Incident reports conveyed a story viewers never witnessed. Cattle knock down crew personnel. Restraints are broken by animals. Emergency events happening quicker than cameras could react. Insurance costs climbed. Liability concerns escalated. The setting that previously felt controllable now looked increasingly unstable, especially with an elderly lead whose work could not be isolated from physical risk. At the same time, criticism from within the veterinary profession had reached a persistent level. The show was continuously scrutinized due to numerous complaints, disciplinary decisions, and appeals. Some punishments were overturned because of inadequacies in Michigan's veterinary legislation. Others were upheld. However, the damage to one's reputation was genuine, regardless of the legal conclusion. For a network predicated on educational reputation, the tension became impossible to ignore. Even Dr. Paul did not advocate such a conclusion. He never announced retirement. He never stepped away openly. He continued to appear, counsel, and insist on being involved even as his function at Pole Veterinary Services grew increasingly restricted. However, those closest to him could see the truth. Physically, he was no longer able to maintain the speed that defined the show. And without that speed, the assumption itself began to crumble. National Geographic Wild considered every aspect behind closed doors: safety, liability, ethics, sustainability. There was no single occurrence to point to publicly, no big declaration, just a quiet decision that the risks now outweighed what the show could reasonably give. In early 2024, the decision was made to bring the series to a stop after more than 2 decades of episodes. When the cameras stop, what's left? When the magnificent Dr. Paul eventually ended, there was no single moment of collapse, no public scandal, no dramatic goodbye speech that explained everything. Rather, what was left was something more subdued and depressing. A guy in his 80s, poised at the edge of a life spent almost exclusively in service, forced at last to slow down. At 83, Dr. Jan Paul is no longer the unstoppable figure viewers initially met. His role at Paul Veterinary Services has evolved. Farm calls and emergencies are now physically handled by younger veterinarians. Dr. Paul no longer charges into barns at all hours, but he still offers advice, consultation, and presence when he can. The clinic he started from a single room in his garage is still there, but without the man who was its lifeblood, its future seems doubtful. What the show never properly represented was the cumulative cost. Decades of heavy labor left his physique battered and frail. Methods he used without hesitation were called into doubt by years of public scrutiny, and the personal losses, especially the murder of his grandson Adam, altered him in ways no audience could completely see. A sense of powerlessness he had never experienced before was brought about by grief for someone whose identity was based on rescuing lives. The accident that altered everything was not just the moment a crew member was harmed or the instant safety could no longer be ignored. It was the meeting point of all the unseen forces: age, risk, loss, liability, and tiredness, and prompted a reckoning. The cameras didn't stop because the tale ran out. They stopped because the cost had become too great. Do you agree the wonderful Dr. Paul finished at the right moment? Or should he have stepped away sooner for his own safety? Post your opinions in the comments section. Remember to like, subscribe, and join us for more unseen tales behind the faces we believe we know if this story touched you.